My boyfriend told me his mistress was better than me in every way and expected me to move out so she could move in. Now, he is begging me to save him. My boyfriend Kevin told me his mistress Lori was better than me in every way during dinner at our apartment in February. He said it casually while eating the pasta I'd made, like he was discussing the weather. He said Lori was more fun, more attractive, more successful, and definitely better in bed. I asked him if he was really telling me about his affair this way. He shrugged and said it wasn't really an affair since we weren't married, and he'd been planning to break up with me anyway. He said he just wanted to be honest about why our relationship wasn't working. I asked how long this had been going on, and he said 4 months, which meant he'd been sleeping with her since before Thanksgiving. He said he would have ended things sooner, but he needed someone to split rent with until Lori's lease ended in March. I sat there stunned while Kevin explained that Lori was everything I wasn't. She was spontaneous while I was boring, she was ambitious while I was complacent, and she understood him while I just nagged. He said he'd been miserable with me for over a year, but stayed because leaving seemed like too much work. He actually thanked me for being so predictable that he could easily schedule time with Lori without me noticing. I asked him why he was telling me this now, and he said Lori's lease was up next week, so she'd be moving in here. He expected me to move out by then since the apartment was in his name, even though I'd paid half the rent for 2 years. He said he'd already told Lori she could have the bigger closet that I was currently using. Kevin then pulled out his phone to show me pictures of them together like I'd asked to see them. He scrolled through photos of them at restaurants I'd wanted to try, concerts he'd said he was too tired to attend with me, and weekend trips he'd claimed were work conferences. He seemed proud of how well he'd managed the deception, and said I should be impressed by his organizational skills. He even showed me the separate calendar he kept to track his lies and said it was exhausting maintaining 2 relationships. I asked him if he felt bad at all, and he laughed. He said why would he feel bad about upgrading to someone better? He said I should be grateful he was being honest instead of just ghosting me like he'd originally planned. He said Lori had convinced him to tell me the truth because she wanted to redecorate without my stuff in the way. The next day, Kevin went to work expecting me to start packing. Instead, I started making phone calls. First, I called Kevin's mother, Diane, who adored me and had no idea about Lori. I told her everything Kevin had said, word for word, including the part about me being boring in bed. Diane was horrified and said she'd raised him better than this. She said she'd been planning to give Kevin his grandmother's engagement ring, but now she'd rather throw it in the ocean. Then I called Kevin's boss, Robert, who was also his mentor. Robert had helped Kevin get promoted twice and thought of him like a son. I mentioned that Kevin had been using his company credit card for dates with Lori, which I knew because I'd seen the statements he carelessly left on the counter. Robert said that was a fireable offense and he'd need to investigate immediately. I also called our landlord because the apartment wasn't actually in Kevin's name like he'd claimed. We were both on the lease, which meant he couldn't just kick me out. I told the landlord that Kevin was planning to move in another person without permission, which violated our lease agreement. The landlord said if Kevin wanted changes to the occupancy, everyone would need to reapply and qualify individually. Next, I contacted Lori directly through social media. I told her I was happy to move out but wanted to warn her about a few things. I mentioned Kevin's credit card debt that he'd hidden from both of us, his gambling problem that drained his savings, and the medication he took for a persistent fungal infection he'd claimed was cured. I said I just wanted her to be informed since Kevin believed in total honesty now. Lori messaged back asking what fungal infection and what gambling problem. Turns out Kevin had told her he was financially stable and perfectly healthy. I also mentioned that Kevin had described their intimate life to me in detail and compared us extensively, which made Lori furious because she thought that was private. By evening, Kevin's life was unraveling. His mother called him screaming about disrespecting women and said he was no longer welcome at Easter dinner. His boss called him into an emergency meeting about misuse of company funds. The landlord called saying there had been a complaint about unauthorized occupants. And Lori called him crying, saying she couldn't believe he'd shared intimate details about her with his ex. Kevin came home panicking and asked what I'd done. I told Kevin exactly what I did. I called his mother and told her about Lori. I called his boss and mentioned the company credit card charges. I contacted the landlord about the lease. I messaged Lori about his health issues and gambling problem. Kevin's face went white like someone had drained all the blood from his head. He started yelling that I was crazy and vindictive. He said I ruined his life over a breakup. I stayed calm on the couch and pointed out that he ruined his own life by lying to everyone who trusted him. I said I just told people the truth he'd been hiding. He kept shouting that I had no right to interfere in his relationships. I reminded him he'd been interfering in my life for 4 months while sleeping with someone else in my bed. He grabbed his phone and started pacing around the living room like a caged animal. Kevin called Lori first. The phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. He left a message saying they needed to talk and that I was spreading lies about him. He tried a 3rd time and I watched his face crumble when she didn't pick up. Then he called his mother. I heard Diane answer and immediately start yelling through the speaker. She called him a disappointment and said she couldn't believe she raised someone who would treat women this way. Kevin tried to explain, but she hung up on him mid-sentence. He stared at his phone like it had betrayed him. He was breathing too fast and sweating even though the apartment wasn't warm. I sat on the couch feeling strangely calm while watching him fall apart. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Part of me felt bad for him, but most of me felt nothing at all. My phone buzzed with a text from Evie asking if I was okay. I'd sent her a message earlier saying Kevin and I broke up but hadn't given details. I got up and walked to my bedroom while Kevin kept trying to call people back. I closed the door and sat on my bed before calling Evie. She answered immediately asking what happened. I told her everything from the dinner confession to the phone calls I made today. Evie was quiet for a long moment before saying she couldn't believe Kevin actually showed me pictures of his affair, like it was something to be proud of. She said she was shocked but also weirdly proud of me for standing up for myself instead of just crying and packing. She offered to come over right now to help me figure out what to do next. I told her I appreciated it but needed tonight to process everything. She made me promise to call her tomorrow and said she'd bring coffee and breakfast, so we could make a plan. Kevin's phone rang at 9 p.m. I heard him answer in the living room with a shaky voice. It was Robert, his boss. Robert's voice was loud enough that I could hear him from my bedroom even through the closed door. He demanded Kevin come to the office first thing tomorrow morning with documentation for every personal charge on his company card. Kevin tried to say it was a misunderstanding, but Robert cut him off. He said they would discuss it professionally tomorrow with HR present, and that Kevin should bring a lawyer if he felt he needed one. The call ended and I heard Kevin throw something against the wall. It sounded like his phone hitting the drywall. I stayed in my room with the door locked. My laptop pinged with an email notification around 9:30. I opened it to find a message from the landlord sent to both Kevin and me. The email explained that both our names were on the lease as equal tenants. Any changes to occupancy required written notice from all current tenants and approval from the landlord. The landlord reminded us that adding unauthorized occupants was a violation of our lease agreement and could result in eviction for both parties. I heard Kevin's laptop open in the living room. He got quiet for a few minutes. Then I heard him reading the email out loud to himself like he couldn't believe what it said. He read it 3 times. I heard him slam his laptop shut and start pacing again. I got ready for bed around 11 p.m. I locked my bedroom door from the inside and climbed under the covers. Kevin was still up in the living room. I could hear him typing frantically on his phone. Every few minutes, I heard his voice talking to someone. He was begging Lori to answer and saying he could explain everything. He promised he never meant to hurt her. He said I was lying about some things to get revenge. His voice got more desperate each time he left a message. Around midnight, I heard him crying. Not just quiet tears, but actual sobbing like a kid who lost something important. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling nothing. I thought I would feel guilty or sad, but I just felt empty and tired. Kevin's alarm went off at 6:30 the next morning. I heard him moving around the apartment getting ready for work. He looked terrible when I saw him through my bedroom door crack. His eyes were red and puffy. His hair stuck up in weird directions. His shirt was wrinkled like he'd slept in it. He left without saying anything to me. I waited until I heard the front door close before getting up. I called my boss and said I needed a sick day for personal reasons. She was understanding and told me to take care of myself. I texted Evie that Kevin was gone and she could come over. She showed up 40 minutes later with 2 large coffees and a bag of bagels from the place near her apartment. Evie sat with me at the kitchen table while I ate and told her more details about yesterday. She asked practical questions about the lease and my finances. We made a list of things I needed to do. First was figuring out if I wanted to keep the apartment or move out. Second was protecting my money and belongings. Third was deciding how to handle Kevin going forward. Evie suggested I open my own bank account if we had any joint accounts. I realized we had a shared account for rent and utilities. I needed to remove my money before Kevin did something stupid. Evie also said I should take photos of everything valuable I owned in case Kevin tried to claim things were his. We spent 2 hours making plans and writing everything down. My phone buzzed with a text from Kevin at 10:15 a.m. The message said he'd been suspended without pay pending the investigation into his company card charges. He said I destroyed his career over a relationship that wasn't even that serious. He said I was vindictive and cruel for contacting his boss about personal matters. I showed the text to Evie. She read it and rolled her eyes. She said Kevin was trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty when he was the one who committed fraud. I didn't respond to his text. There was nothing to say. He made his choices, and now he had to deal with what happened because of them. My phone rang around 11 a.m. It was Diane calling me directly. I answered nervously because I wasn't sure if she was mad at me for telling her about Kevin's affair. Instead, she apologized for her son's behavior. She said she raised him better than this, and she was ashamed of the man he'd become. She offered me her guest room if I needed somewhere to stay while figuring out the apartment situation. She said she wanted to remove me from Kevin's mess and give me space to think clearly. Her kindness broke something inside me. I started crying for the first time since this whole thing started. Not because I was sad about Kevin, but because someone actually cared about how I was doing. Diane stayed on the phone with me while I cried and told me to take my time deciding what I wanted to do. A message notification popped up on my laptop from social media. It was from Lori. She asked if we could talk in person because she needed to understand what was real and what Kevin had lied about. She said she felt stupid and angry and confused. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide how to respond. Evie looked over my shoulder and said I should meet with her if I felt comfortable. She said Lori and I were both victims of Kevin's selfishness, even though our situations were different. I typed back that I would meet her for coffee. We agreed on a place near downtown for the next day at 2 p.m. I felt weird about meeting my boyfriend's mistress, but also like it was the right thing to do. The coffee shop downtown had those small round tables that wobbled if you leaned on them wrong. I got there 15 minutes early and sat near the window watching people walk past on the sidewalk. My hands shook a little when I lifted my cup. Lori arrived exactly at 2 p.m. wearing a gray coat and carrying a leather bag. She looked tired around her eyes, like she hadn't been sleeping well. I raised my hand so she could see me, and she walked over without smiling. She sat down across from me and put her bag on the empty chair. Neither of us said anything for a minute. She ordered coffee from the waiter who came by, and then she looked at me directly. She asked if everything I told her was true. I said yes, and asked what Kevin had told her about me. She said he told her I was his roommate who helped with rent because I was going through a hard time financially. She said he told her we used to date years ago, but stayed friends because the breakup was mutual and drama-free. She said he claimed I knew about her and was happy he found someone. I felt my stomach twist because the lies were so detailed and so opposite from reality. I asked when they met, and she said at a work conference in October. She said Kevin told her he was single and successful and looking for something serious. I pulled out my phone and showed her photos of Kevin and me from September at his company picnic. She stared at the photos for a long time. Her coffee arrived and she wrapped both hands around the cup like she needed something to hold. I asked what else Kevin told her, and she said he described his job as stable with great benefits and said he was saving for a house. I told her about the credit card debt and the gambling problem that ate through his paycheck every month. She asked how I knew about the gambling, and I explained that I found the betting apps on his phone 6 months ago when he asked me to check his messages. She closed her eyes and pressed her fingers against her forehead. She said Kevin told her he owned the apartment outright and was thinking about buying a second property as an investment. I explained we were both on the lease and splitting rent 50-50 for 2 years. She asked why he would lie about something so easy to check. I said I'd been asking myself the same question about a lot of things. We compared more details and realized Kevin told each of us completely different versions of his life. She thought he worked late most evenings building his career, while I thought he had a gambling problem that kept him out. She thought he was financially responsible, while I knew about the hidden debts. She thought their relationship was private and special, while he was describing it to me in graphic detail. Lori started crying quietly, and I handed her napkins from the dispenser on the table. She said she felt stupid for believing everything without questioning it. She said she should have noticed the signs, but Kevin was so confident and specific with his stories. I told her that confident liars are the hardest ones to catch because they don't act guilty. She asked why I told her the truth, and I said she deserved to make informed choices about her life. I said I wasn't trying to hurt her, but I also wasn't going to let Kevin keep lying to both of us. She wiped her eyes and said she understood, even though it was painful to hear. She asked if I hated her, and I said no. I said we were both victims of the same person's selfishness, even if our situations were different. She nodded and drank some of her coffee. We sat there for another 20 minutes talking about smaller details and filling in gaps in the timeline. She paid for her coffee and I paid for mine. We walked out together and stood on the sidewalk for a minute. She said she needed time to think about everything. I said I understood and that she could message me if she had more questions. She thanked me for being honest, even though it wrecked her version of reality. We went separate directions, and I walked back to my car feeling heavy and strange. Kevin came home that evening around 6:30 and found me in the bedroom putting clothes into boxes. He stood in the doorway looking relieved and said he was glad I was finally being reasonable about moving out. I kept folding shirts without looking at him. He asked when I'd be gone, and I said I wasn't leaving. He asked what I was doing then, and I explained I was moving my valuable things to Diane's house for safekeeping while we figured out the apartment situation properly and legally. His face changed from relieved to confused to angry in about 3 seconds. He asked why I was involving his mother, and I said she offered to help me. He started yelling that I had no right to turn his family against him. I closed the box I was packing and taped it shut. He followed me to the living room, still yelling about how I was destroying his life on purpose. I stacked the box near the door with 2 others I'd already packed. He grabbed my arm to make me look at him, and I pulled away. He started crying suddenly, with his face crumpling like a little kid. He said he made mistakes but didn't deserve to lose everyone he cared about. I sat down on the couch, and he sat on the floor in front of me, still crying. He said his mom wouldn't answer his calls and Lori blocked him and his job was in trouble. He said I was taking everything from him. I waited until he stopped talking, and then I said consequences aren't punishment. I said they're just the natural results of his choices. I said people have the right to decide how they respond to being lied to. He asked what that meant, and I explained that his mother chose to be disappointed in him, His boss chose to investigate fraud, and Lori chose to feel betrayed. I said I didn't make those choices for them. He said I told them things specifically to hurt him. I said I told them the truth and they decided what to do with that information. He put his head in his hands and kept crying. I got up and went back to the bedroom to pack more things. He stayed in the living room and I could hear him calling someone, probably trying Lori again. Over the next week, Kevin tried different approaches to fix his situation. On Tuesday, he apologized through my bedroom door saying he was sorry for everything and wanted to work things out. On Wednesday, he sent long texts making excuses about stress and pressure and not thinking clearly. On Thursday, he accused me of overreacting and blowing things out of proportion. On Friday, he promised he would change and go to therapy and be better. I didn't respond to any of it. I stayed at Diane's house in her comfortable guest room with the blue walls and the soft bed. She made dinner every night and we watched TV shows together. She asked if I was okay and I said I was getting there. Kevin kept texting me about apartment things mixed with more apologies and promises. I only responded to the practical questions about bills and maintenance. He asked when I was coming back and I said when I was ready. He said he missed me and I didn't reply. Diane told me I could stay as long as I needed and that Kevin had to learn actions have consequences. She said she loved her son, but she didn't like the person he'd become. I helped her with dishes after dinner and she told me stories about Kevin as a kid. She said he used to be kind and thoughtful before something changed in his 20s. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just listened. My coworker Juliet noticed I seemed distracted at work the following Monday. She asked if everything was okay during our break and I said it was complicated. She suggested lunch and I agreed. We went to the sandwich place across the street and sat in a booth near the back. She asked what was going on and I told her the whole story from the beginning. I explained about Kevin's affair and his plan to move Lori in and his lies to everyone. I told her about the phone calls I made and how everything fell apart for him in one evening. She listened without interrupting and her eyes got wider as I talked. When I finished, she said that was the most dramatic thing she'd heard in years. She asked if I felt bad about what happened to Kevin and I said sometimes, but mostly no. She told me she went through something similar 5 years ago with her ex-husband. She said he cheated with someone from his gym and tried to make her feel crazy for being suspicious. She said she eventually gathered evidence and presented it to his family at Thanksgiving dinner. I asked what happened, and she said he lost his family's respect, and his girlfriend left him when she realized he was lying to her too. She said it took her a while to stop feeling guilty about exposing him. She said eventually she realized she just told the truth, and people made their own choices about how to respond. I said that was exactly how I felt. She said the guilt would probably come and go for a while, but I should remember I didn't create the situation. She said Kevin did that himself. We finished lunch and went back to work. I felt less alone knowing someone else understood these complicated feelings about revenge and justice. Kevin's company sent him an email on Tuesday morning. He forwarded it to me with a message saying this was my fault. The email said they were terminating his employment effective immediately after their investigation revealed over $3,000 in unauthorized personal charges over 4 months. I read it twice and then I read his message calling me vindictive and cruel. I stared at my phone for a long time deciding whether to respond. Finally, I typed back that his choices created these consequences, and I was done being his scapegoat. I said he used company money for personal expenses, and that was fraud regardless of why it got discovered. I said he lied to his boss who trusted him, and that broke their professional relationship. I said none of that was my fault. I blocked his number after sending it because I was tired of his attempts to make me responsible for his problems. The landlord emailed both of us on Wednesday afternoon. The email said we needed to resolve the lease situation since we clearly couldn't continue as roommates. It outlined our options, including one person buying out the other, or both of us leaving so new tenants could take over. Kevin replied within an hour, asking if I would agree to let Lori take over my half of the lease. I actually laughed out loud when I read it. I replied to the landlord saying I was declining that option and planned to stay in the apartment. I said Kevin was welcome to find someone else to take over his portion, or he could move out, and I would find a new roommate. The landlord replied saying that was acceptable and Kevin would need to make arrangements. Kevin sent me an angry message asking why I was being difficult. I didn't respond. Lori messaged me on Thursday night. She said she was ending things with Kevin completely after learning about his employment termination. She said finding out about the financial instability he hid from her was the final piece of information she needed. She said she deserved better than someone who treats people as interchangeable and disposable. She thanked me for being honest with her even though it was painful to learn the truth. She said she hoped I found happiness and peace after everything. I thanked her for the message and wished her the same. I felt relieved that she saw Kevin clearly now and made her own choice to walk away. Kevin finally accepted that he needed to be the one to move out. He started looking at cheaper apartments he could afford on unemployment. Diane called me on Saturday to say Kevin asked her for help with a deposit on a studio apartment across town. She said she agreed to help him one last time, but made it clear this was the final financial assistance he would get from her. She said he needed to prove through his actions that he'd changed his behavior and his attitude. She said she hoped losing everything would teach him to value people and tell the truth. I thanked her for everything she'd done for me. She said I was always welcome in her home and she considered me family regardless of what happened with Kevin. That made me cry again, but this time it felt different from before. I felt like something in me had shifted from broken to angry, which gave me more energy than sadness ever could. The landlord scheduled a mediation meeting for the following Tuesday at a conference room in the building's management office. Kevin and I sat on opposite sides of a long table with the mediator between us, a woman named Carol who reviewed our lease agreement and the situation we'd both described in separate emails. She explained that since we were both on the lease with equal rights, neither of us could force the other out, but we could arrange a voluntary transfer if both parties agreed. Kevin stared at the table while Carol talked, his jaw tight and his hands clenched in his lap. I told Carol I wanted to stay in the apartment and would be willing to take over Kevin's portion of the lease if the landlord approved. Kevin finally spoke up and said he couldn't afford to keep paying rent without a job anyway, so he'd sign whatever was needed to get out. Carol produced the transfer documents and explained each section while Kevin sat there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He signed every page without reading them, his signature getting messier as he went through the stack. When Carol asked if he understood he was giving up all rights to the apartment, he just nodded and pushed the papers back across the table. The whole meeting took less than 30 minutes, and when it was done, the apartment was legally mine alone. Kevin stood up to leave and looked at me like he wanted to say something, but I gathered my copies of the documents and walked out first. I heard him tell Carol he'd be out by the weekend, and I kept walking without looking back. Kevin moved his stuff out on Saturday morning while I stayed at Diane's house to avoid another confrontation. He texted me when he was done, just a short message saying his key was on the kitchen counter. I drove back to the apartment that afternoon and walked through rooms that felt both familiar and completely different without his presence filling the space. His furniture was gone from the living room, leaving empty spots on the carpet where his couch and TV stand had been. The bathroom only had my toiletries on the counter, and the bedroom closet was half empty where his clothes used to hang. I stood in the middle of the living room and realized I could do whatever I wanted with this space now. Evie came over Sunday morning with painting supplies and a playlist of angry breakup songs. We moved all my furniture to the center of the rooms and covered everything with drop cloths. The walls had been this pale beige color that Kevin picked when we first moved in, and I'd always hated how boring it looked. Evie helped me paint the living room a warm gray blue that reminded me of early morning sky. We worked for hours, covering the old color with fresh paint, and laughing about how bad we were at cutting clean edges along the ceiling. Diane showed up around noon with sandwiches and a small bookshelf she said she didn't need anymore. She stayed to help with the second coat and told stories about redecorating her own house after Kevin's father left, how changing her space helped her feel like herself again. By evening, the living room looked completely different, the new color making everything feel calmer and more like mine. Evie helped me rearrange the furniture using pieces Diane brought to fill the empty spots, and we ordered pizza to celebrate finishing the first room. I fell asleep that night in my apartment that was finally just mine, exhausted but feeling more settled than I had in weeks. A month passed with me getting used to living alone and actually enjoying the quiet. I established new routines, bought groceries I wanted instead of things Kevin liked, and started sleeping better without his presence in the bed next to me. My email notification chimed one Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, and I saw Kevin's name in my inbox. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it instead. The message was longer than I expected and completely different from his previous angry texts. He wrote that he'd been doing a lot of thinking since everything fell apart, and he realized how cruel and selfish he'd been during our relationship, and especially during the breakup. He said losing his job forced him to look at his spending habits and his tendency to blame other people for his own choices. He said Lori breaking up with him made him understand how it felt to be on the receiving end of someone's dishonesty. He said his mother refusing to speak to him for 2 weeks showed him how much damage his behavior caused to people who cared about him. He wrote that he'd started seeing a therapist to figure out why he treated people like they were disposable, and he was beginning to understand patterns in his behavior he'd never noticed before. He said he didn't expect me to forgive him or respond to this email, but he wanted me to know he was genuinely sorry for everything he put me through. He said I deserved better than how he treated me, and he hoped I was doing well. I read the email 3 times, looking for signs of manipulation or attempts to get something from me. It seemed genuine, and part of me appreciated that he was finally taking responsibility for his actions. But I also realized I didn't need his apology to move forward with my life. I'd already processed what happened and built something new for myself. I closed the email without responding and went back to cooking dinner, feeling nothing but mild satisfaction that he was facing his issues honestly. 3 months after everything exploded, I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning drinking coffee and reading news on my phone. The apartment was completely mine now, decorated exactly how I wanted with plants on the windowsills and art on the walls that Kevin would have hated. My boss had offered me a promotion the previous week, a step up with better pay and more responsibility that I'd been working toward for over a year. I'd been casually seeing someone I met through a friend, a guy named Gabriel who actually listened when I talked and made plans he kept instead of canceling last minute. Nothing serious yet, but he treated me with basic respect and consideration that felt amazing after what I'd been through with Kevin. Evie came over that afternoon to help me hang new curtains in the bedroom, and while we worked, she joked that revenge looked good on me. I laughed and told her it wasn't really about revenge anymore. What changed everything was finally learning to value myself enough to walk away from someone who didn't appreciate me. That confidence shifted how I moved through the world, how I handled situations at work, how I approached new relationships, and how I made decisions about my own life. I wasn't the same person who sat at that dinner table in February listening to Kevin compare me to his mistress. I'd become someone who knew what I deserved and wouldn't settle for less. The apartment, the promotion, the new relationship, all of it came from that fundamental shift in how I saw myself. Evie said that was the best kind of ending, and I agreed while we hung the last curtain panel and stepped back to admire how the room looked bathed in afternoon light, filtering through the new fabric.